Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Mauricio Villacres, CHLI Programs and Strategic Partnerships Manager. Welcome to the CHLI Public Policy Briefing Series. Before we start today's program, I have a few details to share. First, this briefing is being recorded. It will be available on CHLI's YouTube next week. Whether you are in person or watching via live stream, we encourage you to join in the conversation today through social media at CHLI. And we ask you to help us share the speaker's point of views as well as your own. We'd like to remind you, if you're tuning in virtually, feel free to use the chat feature within the program to share, connect, and discuss all points of views. To participate in our Q&A portion, please submit your questions to the Q&A feature and not the chat. Those attending in person, please hold your questions to the end. After the panel discussion, there will be time for some questions and mics will be passed around. So I want you to now please help me welcome CHLI board member Mark Gonzalez with AT&T.
Thank you. On behalf of AT&T and my colleague Celeste, I'd like to welcome you to the AT&T Forum. We're very proud of our involvement with the Congressional Hispanic Leadership Institute, and today's briefing on the digital divide demonstrates why. At AT&T, this is an issue that we've been working to address for a very, very long time. And so this program is very, very timely. And like you, I'm looking forward to hearing the insights of some very talented and knowledgeable people. Now it is my pleasure to turn it over to Marianne Gomez Horta.
Good afternoon, buenas tardes. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, usually I don't need the microphone, so yeah. So thank you again for joining us today in this important conversation on the digital divide. We wanted to take this time to make a couple of comments, kind of get some things going here before we also have a couple of members of Congress join us. The Congressional Hispanic Leadership Institute, known as CHLI, is the premier organization founded by members of Congress and corporate leaders to advance the Hispanic community's economic progress with a focus on social responsibility and global competitiveness. Founded in 2003, CHLI is a 501c3 leadership development nonprofit. The board of directors is comprised of bipartisan members of Congress, diverse backgrounds and heritages. And we've already met one of them, Mark Gonzalez. Our other board member is on the panel, Leo Munoz with Comcast. Again, thank you for taking the time to be on the panel. And then the other one in the house, because you know you always have to acknowledge your bosses in the house first, is Lakeitha Anderson with Brownstein. Thank you for being here. The briefing series themes are based on a combination of pressing issues and information that we get from our leadership on the board of directors, as well as our advisory council. Many of the different topics that we discuss every year are related to diversity of thought, leadership development, public service, corporate social responsibility, commerce and trade, entrepreneurship, workforce development, energy and environment, and obviously as today, technology and innovation. We do not attempt to influence legislation. We do not support nor oppose any legislation at the federal, state, or local level. We're here to inform and educate and make sure that you all have an opportunity to connect with each other as well as for our participants via Zoom today. Today's panel of experts incorporates different points of view from different expertise, which is why we just love these discussions. Dewana Terry is a special advisor to Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel. Did I get that right? Yes. Okay. And Acting Director, Office of Workplace Diversity at the Federal Communications Commission, FCC. And I'm going to try my best to not use all the acronyms, but when I'm going to say them now because chances are they're going to do it. And then Laura Berrocal, Vice President of Policy and External Affairs at Charter Communications, also a member of our advisory council. Thank you for being here. Rosa Mendoza, President and CEO at Alvanza. Thank you, Rosa. As I mentioned, Leo Munoz, Executive Director at Comcast Corporation. Thanks again, Leo. And Saul Hernandez, Vice President of Government Relations at the Internet and Television Association, known as NCTA. So thanks again, Saul. And today's panel is going to be moderated by Fin Gomez, the Political Director at CBS News, no relation. He's great, but no relation. And want to introduce him in a little bit here, but before doing so, want to acknowledge our sponsors for the Public Policy Series. So we have 4 public policy sessions, discussions throughout the year. And we get a variety of sponsors to help us promote these conversations as well as be part of the discussions, depending on the topics and when they can participate. So thank you again to Accenture, to Apple, Amazon, American Petroleum Institute, Becker, Charter Communications, Chevron, Ducenta Squared, Ford Motor Company, General Motors, Intuit, the National Association of Broadcasters, and Pacific Gas and Electric. So please join me in a thank you to our sponsors. And I know some of you are here in the house, so thank you. Okay, and now I think I have an opportunity to introduce Fiend. So hold on a second. We're actually waiting for one of the congressmen, but before, since he's not here, let me go ahead and jump in and introduce Fiend. And as many of you know, here in Washington, we move on, and when the member shows up, we take a pause and we give the floor to the member. So we will come back to that in a little bit here. So first off, want to recognize David Benia, the Executive Director of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. We have been in a great discussion and partnership to make sure that we incorporate members of NHJ in whatever programming opportunities we have. It's also our way of making sure that we promote Latino talent in the newsrooms and help up-and-coming journalists as well to get the exposure and the opportunities they need for other opportunities and moving up. So thank you again to David. So Fiend currently serves as the political director at CBS News. He oversees the network's political campaign coverage on a daily basis. And he can tell you all a lot more about that when he's up here. The unit includes political reporters and producers and manages CBS's news team of campaign reporters. Gomez brings cross-platform political journalistic experience to his role as a political director, including 7 years as a White House producer for CBS News, and prior to that for Fox News. He has also covered 4 presidential campaign cycles from the campaign trail and 3 administrations. I'm already tired. Okay. Gomez is the first Latino journalist to serve on the White House Correspondents Association's Board of Directors in its 108-year history, and a former national board member of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. Fiend is the first Latino political director to any news network. Join me in giving him a very, very big bienvenida. Thank you, Fiend. All right, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Marianne. I really appreciate that incredibly generous introduction, and thank you all for being here on a beautiful June afternoon. I want to thank everyone here, everyone on Zoom, and just a reminder that this is being recorded. So we're going to have some questions and answer session now with our esteemed panelists here, but afterwards, please, if you have questions, get them ready. I want to hear them, because we are going to come to you for a Q&A period. So just a reminder. So if you're thinking about maybe asking a question, ask that question. Get ready. Prep it. All right. So, and for those connected in Zoom, just a reminder, please share your questions in the question and answer box. And our fabulous experts on that panel over there who are running the board will get to those questions. So, but again, it will be at the end. Yeah, it is an absolute pleasure to be here today, as I said, and really discussing a very incredible and crucial topic that I think deserves more attention, and that is the digital divide. And again, with such an insightful and diverse panel, I myself hope to learn a lot more. I am my purview is politics. I cover campaign politics. That's what I do. But this is an issue of tremendous importance, and I'm really grateful to have the opportunity, as I'm sure you are, to discuss and learn more about this topic with this incredible panel. So I'm with you. We're here. We're going to get some information, and we're going to see what's being done on this issue that is really impacting communities across the country and across this landscape. Very important. So, okay, let's get started. And please help me welcome our panelists today. Dewana Terry is the special advisor to the FCC Chairwoman, Jessica Rosenworcel, and Acting Director, Office of Workplace Diversity at the Federal Communications Commission. Welcome. In February 22, Ms. Terry was appointed to lead the Federal Communications Commission Task Force on Preventing Digital Discrimination. She has served in numerous senior positions at the FCC since joining the agency from private practice in 1994. Most recently, she was the Associate Bureau Chief of the Wireline Competition Bureau. Ms. Terry also served as an Associate Bureau Chief and Chief of Staff in both the Wireless Telecommunications Bureau and the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau. In addition, she also served as Acting Deputy Bureau Chief of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau. That's a lot to say. That's a quite extensive and very impressive bio. Laura Barrowcall, as Marianne mentioned, is Vice President of Policy and External Affairs at Charter Communications. In this role, Laura enables the company to work collaboratively with industry stakeholders and leading national organizations to drive legislative and regulatory solutions that benefit the communities Charter serves, its customers, and the company's business development objectives. She has also worked with several national and international organizations providing public policy counsel in the areas of technology, energy, and health. She also serves on the board of directors of the National Foundation for Women Legislators and the Women in Cable Telecommunications Network. She's also an appointed member of the Women in Leadership Executive Program and Advisory Council with the George Washington University School of Business. Rosa Mendoza is President and CEO at Avanza, which is a nonprofit organization that advocates for Latino, Latinx communities and other underserved communities through education and advocacy for more access to innovation and technology. Prior to founding Avanza, Rosa served as the executive director of the Hispanic Technology and Telecommunications Partnership, HTTP, where she advised administration officials, congressional staff, state and local representatives, and other stakeholders on how telecommunications and technology policy issues impacted the Latino community. In addition, Rosa previously served as the manager of special projects for the Raven Group, a national public policy firm where she assisted clients with coalition building, strategic planning, and research with a particular focus on the firm's Latin Strategies division. Leo Munoz is the executive director at Comcast Corporation. Leo has served has over 20 years of experience in politics, public policy, and campaigns. Over the last 2 decades, he's acquired a broad understanding on a breadth of issues at the local, state, and federal levels with respect to these issues. Currently, he is the senior director of federal governmental affairs for Comcast Corporation. He is responsible for shaping and advocating for Comcast's positions on legislative and regulatory matters impacting all lines of business. Prior to his position with Comcast Universal, Leo served as chief of staff to Congressman Charlie Gonzalez in Washington, D.C. He was the chairman of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus from 2011 to 2013. And Leo was a key liaison to the White House, senior elected officials, and heads of state. In addition to serving on the Chile Board of Directors, Leo also serves on the advisory board for the Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies and the Benson Latin American Collection at the University of Texas at Austin. Wow, this is some panel already. I'm excited. I don't know if you guys are. This is incredible.
I think you need a round of applause getting through these bios.
I know, all right. This is a lot. This bio, this is like, this is impressive. Sal Hernandez is Vice President of Government Relations at the Internet and Television Association, the principal trade association representing the cable industry, also known as NCTA. He works closely with members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Congressional Black Caucus, and Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, as well as members of the Senate Commerce Committee, House Committee on Energy and Commerce on Telecommunications. And before joining NCTA, Sal spent more than 15 years on Capitol Hill, working for members of the House of Representatives. And most recently, he served as legislative director, deputy chief of staff, and chief of staff to Congressman G.K. Butterfield of North Carolina, the great state of North Carolina. He is a former member of the Congressional Hispanic Staff Association and Congressional Tech Staff Association and has significant experience leading federal, state, and local political campaigns. He is a member of the Hispanic Lobbyists Association. All right, a round of applause for our esteemed panels. Okay, so why don't we get started? So the digital divide, this is why we're here and this is what we're talking about. This is the topic of incredible focus and importance across this country, as I mentioned, and something that we really have to be addressing here. And this is what we hope to addressing. This is like a solution and an understanding and a solution of what this issue is and how it's impacting our communities. We have lots of questions. We have a great cross-section of people, as I just mentioned, to help us unpack these questions today. I'm going to go across the panel, ask different questions. I have an arsenal of different questions, so I hope they're ready. But here we go. Why don't we get started with Tawana? I think we understand, definitely this panel understands what the digital divide is. For those watching at home, for some of those in the audience, can you explain what the digital divide is?
So I would say in its simplest of terms, it's the gap between those who have access to information and modern communications technology and those who do not. And there are various reasons why when people talk about the digital divide as to why people don't have the same level of access. It can be based on people characteristics such as gender, ethnicity. It can also be based on socioeconomic levels. It can be based on where people live. And it can also be talked about in terms of what people know, what skills people have. And so when you talk about the digital divide and you're focusing on these kind of gaps, often people focus in on certain areas of concentration. So is it a gap in terms of not having access to internet? Is it a gap in terms of your digital literacy, your digital skills? Is it a gap because you don't, I would say, you're not represented in certain sectors? They call them STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Or is it that there's not representation in particular industries? So that is kind of a holistic view, not very formulaic, but just trying to set the stage on what digital divide is.
Thank you for that. And that's a great description. Really appreciate that. What is the FCC doing to close the digital divide?
So the FCC, in terms of trying to close the digital divide, under Chairwoman Rosenworcel, we have a strategic goal of 100% broadband access. And that's what we're striving to do. And in doing that, we know that we need to look at how people have access to the internet, to broadband, and what the reasons are that they don't have it. We have two programs that have really honed in primarily after lessons learned from COVID-19 on the affordability issue. The first one is the Affordability Connectivity Program, which is actually a more recent program which replaced the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, which looked to give persons a discount. It's a subsidized benefit program to give them a discount in terms of internet access plans. And we also have the Emergency Connectivity Fund program, which is aimed more at the homework gap. And some may have heard the term of homework gap, and that's when students don't have access in their homes to keep up with their education, which became a very significant issue during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's the Emergency Connectivity Fund, which is aimed to address the issue of the homework gap and to ensure that students have access, particularly off-campus access to the internet to keep up with their education. So those are highlights of two programs that the FCC is doing in order to get rid of the digital divide.
From your expert perspective, why is the digital divide so significant among communities of color like the Latino community in the United States?
You said from my expert perspective,
Yeah,
right? And so
absolutely.
I think that what I would say is a combination of things. On one level, people often look at the affordability issue. Are there the representation for lower income families happen to have a significant amount of persons of color? There's also this myth that persons of color do not see the value in getting the internet. And so therefore they do not seek it out. And I think that that's truly a myth that we need to address. It's not so much so that you don't see the value, but if it's an affordability issue and you're making a choice between what you think is a luxury item, which at one point in time, particularly pre-pandemic, some people thought that that was a luxury item, as opposed to eating and subsistence levels, that's what you choose to make that choice on. So what we've learned during the pandemic is that it is by far not a luxury item. It is something that is an opportunity. It is a gateway to not only education, but to work, to participating in commerce, as well as staying connected with others. And so I think why it's such an issue for persons of color is that the challenges that are faced by persons of color in order to obtain access to the internet are often not focused on intentionally. And I think with programs such as ACP, I'm sorry I used the acronym, but Affordability
No, I welcome
Connectivity
acronyms. Please use them. That's great.
Program, as well as the Emergency Connectivity Fund, those are opportunities for us to be very intentional about closing the digital divide and to get the benefits to those who need them most and wherever they may be.
Thank you, Ms. Terry. Leo, let's turn to you. Comcast, in many ways, you are at that front line where you see it directly. What are some of the initiatives that your company is doing to help close the digital divide? Like what's the impact that you're seeing?
Sure. Well, we launched a program called Internet Essentials a little over a decade ago in 2011 to start addressing this by offering. It started out as families that had a child on free or reduced school lunch could get high-speed internet for $9.95 a month, and no credit check, blah blah blah, all that good stuff. It was just if you're on the program, you qualify, you're in. Over the last decade, that's expanded to just about anybody that receives any federal benefit, period, whether it's veterans. We've worked with HUD over the years, if you have housing assistance. So through that time, we end up at COVID, and we've learned some stuff over those years. And it's one thing to make it available, and now fortunately through ACP, if you're at 200% of poverty, you get $30 off. And I think every company that is an ISP has some sort of offering that's high-speed internet that falls into that $30 subsidy, so that we can and just so you know, 200% of poverty family affords around $55,000 a year, something like that, depending on what you look at. So there's a lot of people that qualify for this, but just making it available, to your point, is not quite enough, especially in communities of color. We have found that partnering with local partners that have a trusted relationship with people in the communities that we're looking to serve and make aware of these programs goes a long way.
Local partners like who?
And we partner with Munoz, with LULAC, depending on what city we're in, even, and in Houston, there's a couple of neighborhood programs that we work with, but that's true for every major. That's true for all the markets we serve. We try to seek out community partners and get them some funding, and B, training, because it's not just offering high-speed internet. It's making sure, do they have the connectivity? Do they have a device? And do they have some digital literacy training to make sure that they understand and can comprehend the power of having this having connectivity in the home. So we're 100% on with ACP, and we're continuing with Internet Essentials, and we're looking for even more creative ways to bridge the digital divide.
You are seeing an impact with those initiatives.
Over the last decade, we've connected, we think, about something like 10 million people over 10 years. That's a lot of households across the country. But we're really focused on one, making sure that the access is there, but even more so, as we see in a lot of urban areas, making sure that that adoption is also something that we're focused on, to make sure that people know that it's there, and if they're not taking it, trying to dive deeper into why not, and make sure that they get connected.
Great, thank you. Saul, let's go to you. What your association is also directly involved. You're seeing a lot of like the direct evidence, like how the digital divide is very real, right? And how it's impacting, especially like Hispanic households. What are some of the obstacles you're seeing in Hispanic households, in Latino households getting connected to broadband, to the internet? I mean, what is keeping some of these households from adopting these services?
Sure. So I would say, thank you for the question. Writ large, there is about 97% of American households that have access to high-speed broadband, but 30% of those households that have access choose not to adopt the service. And what we have found is there's a number of reasons for that. One, and Duana alluded to several of them. But digital skills and digital literacy are certainly one of the aspects that many folks struggle with. The cost of a device can also serve as a detriment to and as an obstacle to adopting the service. You can have the connection in your house, but if you don't have a device to connect to the internet, it's not particularly useful. And then certainly the cost of service, particularly among lower income households, serves as a barrier to deployment as well. We have talked a lot about, not here, but generally, the relevancy argument, and do want to mention this, and would agree that I think increasingly that is an issue that is becoming less and less of a problem. I think folks generally see that in our increasingly digital world, a broadband connection is critical to participating in the economy, to getting an education, and to visiting your doctor, particularly during the pandemic,
Especially during the pandemic.
and for many other reasons. But I think that that with generational change, to your point, the relevancy piece is becoming less and less of a factor. With respect to Latino households, to answer your question more directly, I think language barriers are certainly a concern, and there's hundreds of billions of dollars that has become available from the federal government to either help with broadband deployment or broadband adoption. There are application processes that are required for a lot of those to participate in a lot of those programs. It's really important that the departments and agencies that control the distribution of those funds or the awarding of those funds meet their audience and meet their consumers where they are, and that can be through digital navigators that are fluent in Spanish.
I was just about to ask you, do you think they need that sort of that liaison connecting? More Spanish-speaking services are needed for people who are connecting with those communities.
Absolutely, and I think the FCC has done a good job at working to deploy folks who can help in that process. You need to partner with trusted folks and leaders in the community to help get this information out. And I think lastly, there may be some hesitancy among some in our community to want to apply for these programs that are funded in part or in whole by the federal government, just because of a lack of trust with what that information is going to ultimately be used for. But I can say there is no should be no concern to anybody, the Latino community or anyone else, to avail themselves of these opportunities if they qualify.
Right. I was actually, speaking to some folks I know who in the Latino community here in the DMV, just in the recent days leading up to this panel, and the majority of them, of these specific group of people, the small unscientific sample that I spoke to, a lot of them were getting their information strictly. The only internet they had accessibility was through their phones. That was it. It was like so surprising to me, and it's some things that I take for granted, right? I have I have my iPad over here, I have my 2 laptops, whatever, like all these things for work, and it's just that's all they had, and some of them didn't even have that. One had like a flip phone, and now especially when it's so much is expected through this connectivity. I mean, for like as you mentioned, our healthcare, our just through the pandemic, knowledge of this like new virus that was surprising everyone. It's so crucial, and it's just that they still have this like such a lack of connectivity. It's just really surprising. You guys prepping your questions? You guys everybody prepping their questions? Good. Okay, you ready? All right. Next question is for Rosa. Okay, let's get to it. Latinos make up 17% of the overall workforce, but represent but 35% of workers have no digital skills or essentially digitally illiterate. Really high. This is according to the National Skills Coalition. Why? Can you tell us why it's so significant? Why do you think there's such a disparity between the high percentage of in the U.S.'s workforce and that digital literacy that exists?
Absolutely. Do you want me to pause and have Marianne continue with the program? I'm assuming the congressman is here, or do you want me to continue with the question?
I think we can continue with the question until I get to
my colleagues mentioned the reason why, right? We have a digital divide that has been very persistent for many, many years. And to me, it's frustrating and shocking that it took a pandemic for people to fully understand that this is an issue that should be addressed and should be solved. We have not focused on this issue the way we need to as a country. And again, it's shocking that it took a pandemic for people to understand that having access to the internet is not a luxury, but a necessity. And obviously, Latinos are on the wrong side of the digital divide. And when you are on the wrong side of the digital divide, you have a lack of access to, vital healthcare opportunities, for example. And when you're on the wrong side, obviously there is a professional and personal and educational underachievement. So we got to close this digital divide once and for all. But one of the main things that we got to do is we got to focus on ensuring that people have the skills that they need in order for, are we going to pause the conversation? Yes.
Sure. Excuse me. Absolutely.
No. Okay, so I'm going to pause here for a little bit. So we have our 2 members of Congress who are here. I'm going to have them come and address the group. We also have, just for the congressman's as a refresher, we have people also joining us via Zoom. Before we actually have them come up and say a few words, I'm going to ask them for a group photo, because if I don't ask them now, I'll forget later. So if you can all please do me a favor and please stand from where you are, and we'll have the 2 congressmen join us. And I'm going to ask that at the end, we also have our other board members, Lakeitha Anderson. Please join us. And did I see another board member here? Because I'll be in trouble if I forget a boss. There you go. Come on up here, Jennifer, and then Mark too. I think let's just go in the middle. Let's go in the middle with the gentleman.
Thank you for your patience. And for the cloud, yeah. Right here, please. Thank you all very much. Right, 3, 2. Great. And again, great smiles. 3, 2. Terrific. Thank you so much.
Everybody's back to their places except my notes here. So I'm going to ask Congressman VC first. I'm going to get started here by mentioning the congressman is an advocate. He's from the Texas 33rd District. Oh, yeah, we already got the shout outs for Texas. Okay. The closest I come is my mom's from Brownsville. So, okay. So the congressman is an advocate for Texas's middle-class families and is committed to creating jobs, improving public education, fighting for immigration reform, and ensuring access to quality health care. He is a leader who leads and establishes organizations or caucuses wherever he sees the need needs to be filled. He founded the first Congressional Voting Rights Caucus. He is a member of the Congressional Black Caucus and the New Democrat Coalition. He now serves on 2 prestigious House committees, the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, on the Communications and Technology Subcommittee, and the House Committee on Armed Forces. Please join me in welcoming to the floor Congressman VC. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. Can y'all hear me okay? Because these are down really far from me. That's always a problem with me when they're kind of mounted like that, but I can probably, yeah.
Want me to be your Vanna?
No. I appreciate that though. And thank you for mentioning me being a Texan. I'm a very proud Texan. And we just keep growing. We have more and more people coming to the state every day. We just announced a new major company moving from the Midwest to Irving yesterday. One of the country's largest companies, and so if you're not from Texas, it sounds like pretty soon you will be. So, welcome y'all. But good afternoon. It's great to be here with everybody today with the Congressional Hispanic Leadership Institute. I want to thank you for inviting me to come out and speak to talk about some really important issues today. And let me just say this too, that it is great to just be back in person. I will tell you that Zoom is a wonderful, wonderful tool, but being able to break bread and talk with people and be in the same room with them is really irreplaceable. And so for today's topic, I have the honor and privilege to work closely on as a member of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. And also,
My tech guys say that they can hear you.
okay, they can hear me. Okay,
Yes.
good. Okay, yeah. As long as everybody can hear me, I was
I don't want you to drop.
worry about it
important
being.
notes.
Yeah, no, I always worry about the microphone being down there. And again, we're all too familiar with the unthinkable story in the most developed country during the early days of the pandemic. And I have a 16-year-old at home that was in 8th grade at the time when the pandemic started. And you would hear about these kids going to the fast food restaurants that were the closest to their house, or trying to go to the coffee shop that had Wi-Fi, just so they could do their homework and keep up in school. And I think there are going to be studies that last a long time from now, once we're really past the pandemic, that will measure and see how these kids have done and what sort of effect that played. And so, I was worried about that. And so I wanted to make sure that I got to work to see how I could address that issue, because again, we were fortunate to have Wi-Fi at our house, but I know that a lot of the kids that my son went to school with, they just did not have that option, and it definitely should not be that way. And that was one of the reasons why we led the broadband, the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, which has now been rebranded as the Affordable Connectivity Program, or the ACP under the infrastructure bill that was just passed, because it put $14 billion into a program that already had, under its original inception, about 12 million Americans that were enrolled. But we also know that approximately 48 million households, or about 40% of the nation, are eligible for this program. And there's no doubt that that access to affordable and reliable broadband internet connection is critical for all Americans in the 21st century. These connections help them to schedule doctor's appointments, search for jobs, complete online school homework, start a business, and do so much more. I'm encouraged by the Biden administration's partnership with many of the major internet service providers, ISPs, to lower the cost of high-speed internet plans for low-income Americans. It really is going to take partnerships like these to assist with outreach and encourage enrollment, not just in the ACP, but other widely available low-cost options that are out there for consumers. Looking ahead, I strongly believe that it's important for Congress to continue to find ways to help us better assess and evaluate how we can continue to ensure these important programs help the economically vulnerable among us. And lastly, I would be remiss not to mention the great work happening at the FCC and NTIA. And I know that the data map coverage, that's something that everyone is watching closely as well. And I do believe these improved maps are really going to help us with accurate broadband data so we can point federal dollars to where they need to be. I remain hopeful that as long as we continue to make smart and informed decisions at the federal level, that we will only inch closer to bridging the digital divide and homework gap in every district across the country, low income, rural, and in between. I look forward to engaging with everybody. And again, it's just wonderful, wonderful, wonderful to see everybody in person. And thank you for inviting me. Really appreciate it very much.
Okay. Next to the podium here is another awesome tall gentleman. So I gotta make sure I adjust these accordingly because of course I'm the Chaparrita Mexicana. So the next is I want to welcome to the podium one of our congressional board members. He's been on our board of directors for quite some time, and one of my personal favorites because he's from California, and so am I. My brother went to Fresno State, which is really close to his district. So Congressman Valedale represents California's 21st Congressional District. In Congress, he is on the prestigious Appropriations Committee, and his main focuses are around military construction, Veterans Affairs, agriculture, and rural development. We at CHLI are proud and can claim him as one of our own congressional members for quite some time. He's also been a host of interns in this office and has alumni working on the staff. And so, of course, please join me in welcoming one of our board members, congressional member, David Valdeo. Thank you, Jeff, for being here.
So this program, CHLI, is something that I've been excited to be a part of for a long time. I mean, obviously, I've got a few alum of the program who are in my office, but even friends who have gone through the program have now gone off to bigger and better things, who started off as interns, are always amazing people. So thank you for the program that you run, Marianne. It really does make a difference, and I think it's a great opportunity for kids. Like Marianne said, my name is David Valdeo. I represent 21st District of California. It's a very rural area, very poor district. It's one of the poorest in the country. Median income is about $45,000. It's also one of the most Hispanic districts in the country, the most Hispanic held by a Republican as of today. Obviously, yesterday's election in Texas, I'll get kicked down to second place. But something I'm very proud of because I do represent an amazing group of people and an amazing district. But it's a pleasure to talk to you about this digital divide thing, because obviously the rural communities struggle more than anywhere else. And I live on a street myself that we're a mile-long stretch of road from one cross intersection to the next. And there's 5 houses on 1 mile stretch of road. No one's going to lay a broadband cable for 5 homes. It just doesn't make sense. There's no way they can justify it. If they're going to run into town, hit an apartment complex, have 500 units, and have access to internet. But in areas like mine, we're always going to struggle. And that's something we've got to find a way to make those more readily available. My neighbors and even some of the homes that we own in the area happen to be employees on my family's farm. We struggled. And I had an internet program that we were connecting broadband over the internet. It was expensive. I ended up connecting with a broadband supplier there on our property and put up a tower and connected some of our homes and connected a few of the employees' homes as well. And it was kind of an interesting deal because I knew that we were struggling because even our local school, where they're trying to connect the schools, and they've done it throughout the communities, but my local school, the one closest to my house, actually didn't have a connection, didn't have broadband service for the students. And so those kids didn't have access to it. And so when I put in my tower, I connected some of our employee houses. And I remember one of our employees' wives actually came out not in tears like bawling, but in tears, excited, happy. And she said, up until this point, our kids just didn't have this opportunity, and now they do. And even though I like to consider myself pretty handy, there have been problems with the tower, and there has been times the internet service has been down and people haven't complained, but like the other day our internet was down, my daughter connected with the hotspot on her phone. But for these kids who have gotten far behind and struggle, and it's hard enough to focus on paying attention in a classroom when you're at home, you've got your siblings, you've got whatever else is going on at home, and it's hard enough to really understand what's going on when you're looking at it from a Zoom perspective. You've got to have some sort of reliable internet. You can't have those where it freezes up or your internet is shaky. And finding ways to make sure we have those opportunities to connect those communities, to connect them with a service that makes sense. And we can't expect the government to do everything, but we have created some things that have been helpful, and we're continuing to do that. I sit on the Appropriations Committee, like it was mentioned. USDA rural development is a big deal for us. We're looking for that middle mile where we can get internet to some of those very small rural communities who are underserved, who don't have access to it, and getting that connection so that it can be something where the average person can afford it. I mean, when I was getting my service, the service at my house, my brother and I split it. We put point to point. We're about 1,000 feet away from each other. We're paying $200 a month for 20 megs symmetrical up and down. I mean, average person can't afford that. We did it. We connected our barn so that it was a business expense. For us to get anything reasonable for these folks, you have to do something people can afford. And you've got some areas north of Northern California have figured it out, but we still got to find those ways. And so there's opportunities to do that. I think our committee has done some things. USDA's Reconnect program has played an important role. We're continuing to fund that, but we're going to continue to force, or at least entice as much as we possibly can, because as those broadband cables are laid in some of those rural areas, having access to that. I have one community in my district right now. I literally just talked to a bunch of the kids that were here touring from that school, Lost Hills. I don't know if you've ever heard of Lost Hills. It's a little town on the edge of the valley. They struggle to get very many, if any, services. They've got one local restaurant that a local farmer actually subsidizes to help keep it open, or else they wouldn't even have a restaurant in that town that they can go to. They're getting one bridge to cross over the freeway because of a local farmer that has the ability to help fund that bridge. So when I meet with the school administration, they say, well, we don't have internet here. We know that there's fiber optic cable a few miles away, but how do we get it here? How do we cross all these different properties? There's some private property, there's some government property. And just looking for those avenues to make those connections, to make those available to those kids, because those kids are ending up in the same situation as what Mr. VC said just before me. They're ending up in the parking lot of their school, they're ending up in the parking lot of local restaurants, if they even have a restaurant, or connecting on their phone and running up their phone bills. And so I know there's a lot of folks in here from industry, and I know everyone is doing their best, but there is a problem here where it's just, you can't justify that expense as a business owner to lay that cable for 5 homes a mile. But that's where the government comes in. And so programs like USDA Reconnect, we supported things in the consolidated appropriations bills. There's a lot of avenues there, but it's not going to happen overnight. And I'm excited that there is a lot of us working on this, but we need more to focus, because what we've lost over this period during the pandemic, when I talk to, I mean, I've literally gone to every one of my school districts, and almost every single one of them says that their kids are at least 2 years behind. And I think of what we lost and the opportunity that this country has lost in education is something we've really got to work hard to make up. And having this dialogue in Congress, with private sector, with all of you, making sure that we can work together, get to a point where we can help these kids get out of this hole, is something that we should all be adamantly working towards. So I want to thank you all for everything you're doing. Thank you, Marianne, for everything you do, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you a little bit.
So we're going to come back to Fiend to kind of continue the program. Sorry if this was this would be what? Would this be a sponsor, a commercial break? Yeah, or something like that. Yeah. So we're back to the regular programming. And obviously, just to kind of paraphrase some of the things that the members brought up, would be great to get back in the Q&A and for our panelists and our experts. But as somebody who grew up in a farm worker camp, that's always been a concern, is being able to make sure that we have access to all these different services. And more importantly, I think that not just the jobs and the work that we need to do, and we have an opportunity to do some of the work remotely, but really about our future, right? We're really focused more on students and high school students and those young adults. So, okay, I'm done with my sponsor remarks. Fiona,
No,
it's up
this
to
is
you.
great. Thank you, Marianne.
And I have no idea where we were.
Yeah, I totally forgot, me too. Like, I think, no, this is,
I have
no, but I think, I think they bring up some really very critical and important points, especially when it comes to education, that 2 years behind, that's just really significant. Wow.
Yes.
Can you comment on that? What is your reaction then, and what can be done with?
Well, I think what I was saying before we took a pause is that it took this pandemic for us to realize that. But this is a problem that has existed and has been, happening way before the pandemic. The examples they both mentioned, both members of Congress mentioned about students going to their local restaurants, to be able to get access to the internet and be able to do their homework. This is an issue that it has been happening for many, many years. And it's an issue that I'm glad is finally getting the attention it needs to get in order for us to be able to solve this problem. But as my colleagues have mentioned, this problem is complicated. It's not just about, going in and building infrastructure and giving people this access. We also have to make sure that people have the skills that they need in order for them to be able to put this access to a good use, right? In order for them to be able to navigate the online world that can be very complicated sometimes, navigated in a safe and an effective way, right? I think you mentioned earlier about the fact that there's a lot of Latinos that use the phone, and that's their only way for them to have access to the internet, and that's accurate, unfortunately. Many Latinos don't have access to the internet in their homes. They don't have access to the internet in a computer. And obviously, there's only so much you can do on the phone, right? You cannot apply for a job. You cannot do your homework by just using a phone. We really need, adequate access and we need the skills in order for us, again, to be able to use that access. So it's a big problem. It's not a simple solution. You need the private sector working with the public sector together, working with organizations like Alvanza, like CHLI, to ensure that we get to the bottom of the problem and really solve it once and for all. Because as I mentioned earlier, those that are on the wrong side of the digital divide, again, are not getting the access to opportunities, vital opportunities, healthcare opportunities, for example. And of course, again, if you're on the wrong side of the digital divide, there's only so much you can do. We live in a society that's very much dependent on technology, on innovation. And if we don't have this access and these skills, how are we going to compete? How are we going to do the jobs of the future, right? You can't. We need this access. It's a necessity, not a luxury. And I'm glad that we're finally focusing on this, but we got to do it right. Otherwise, we're going to be working on this issue for many more years to come.
On that front, I think Pew came out with a study today saying that Latinos only make up 8% of the STEM workforce, 8%, which is really a small percentage, very small percentage. What needs to be done on that front to increase? I mean, you mentioned education, you mentioned those jobs, but we talk about representation, but 8% of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. But it's such a small percentage. What has to be done on that?
It is, and unfortunately, I'm not surprised. Well, we need more Latinos and special Latinas in the STEM fields. Part of the problem why we don't have a lot of students in those fields is because they don't understand the many opportunities that you can get by going into a STEM field. Our kids don't. I think our kids already face a lot of barriers, at home and just in school in general, and they don't have the role models, they don't have the resources, they don't have the education, they don't have mom and dad telling them, hey, go into a STEM field because this is what you can do with a job, with a degree in that area, right? And we got to have a strong pipeline of students in STEM so that we can, make sure that these jobs of the future are also available to Latinos, right? We got to make sure that Latinos are also getting these jobs with all these companies that, let me back it up a little bit. I always tell people, every company in one way or another is or has to become a technology company. They have to, or they don't survive, right? So if all these companies are innovating and they are becoming more and more reliant on technology and innovation and becoming, more innovative, and our students are not going into the STEM fields, and it's going to be really difficult for the Latino community to get those jobs, right? The jobs of the future. So, and that also is relevant to closing the digital divide, right? We got to make sure that the people have the skills, again, as I mentioned. So we have to make sure that Latino students get into the STEM fields early on. Sometimes, by the time people realize that these fields are important or that they should go into these fields, it's a little too late, right? So we got to make sure that we educate young Latinos at an early age. I mean, I'm talking about, kinder, middle school, you name it. They have to learn about these fields. They have to understand, about the many opportunities in these areas. If I grew up in Washington State, in a very small town in central Washington, and if you go back to my community and you talk to high school students, and if you asked any of the students, if you ask them, hey, do you see yourself working for a company like Apple, a company like, I don't know, whatever, you name it, their answer would probably be, no, I don't. And part of the problem is that they don't see this as something attainable. They see this as something that is not for me. Not because they don't want to, not because they don't have the skills, but because they don't have the resources. They don't have the connections. They don't have the role models. So they see it as something unattainable. And that's part of the reason why a lot of these students don't go into those fields, because they're intimidated by these fields, by, everything that they see in these big, companies that are very well known. But we have to teach our students that yes, you can and should go into those fields. Yes, you can get a job at one of these companies. You do have the talent and you can learn the skills, if you take the right classes, if you go, get the right degrees, but they don't have that information. And there's just so much education that we need to do. There has to be a huge educational component when it comes to closing the digital divide, when it comes to getting people in the STEM fields. We really have to educate our community about these issues, how these issues impact them. And we got to educate our young folks about how the things that they can do, the steps that they can take in order for them to go into these fields.
Laura, charters also at the front line of some of these initiatives. You're seeing this digital divide up close, if you will. Like, what are some of the programs? What are you doing? What is Charter doing to close the digital divide? And also just to touch up on something, to follow up on something that one of the congressmen said about rural areas. It's something I don't think we've discussed enough of, and that could be which is also an underserved community that can really hit across different communities, right? Yeah. So can you address that?
Yeah, I'll try and address both. It's great to be here. This is just good to hear the discussion. I think both congressmen had great points. When it comes to digital inclusion, as a broadband company as big as Charter is, we serve 32 million customers. The company has to care about this issue because we are literally going into communities and providing the connectivity. So if we're not invested in the very communities that we're serving, we're not doing our job. And so one thing that I really love about our company is that there is a lot of interaction with business units across the enterprise. And I'll use ACP as an example because we love the acronym. So, that program is being run, obviously, through our company. We're participating. We have our sales team. We have our marketing teams invested. We have our government affairs team, which I am part of, invested. We have our community impact team that understands the impact of what programs like this mean for communities. And we're all talking to each other. And we're all finding ways to make sure that we're doing what we need to do to get the information out to communities. And the stakeholder piece and the partnerships that we have is really important as well. And so I'll give one example of a program because I think it's a great example. It's one of our newest programs. So we have a program called Spectrum Community Assist. It was launched last year. And the goal of the program, it's a $30 million investment. So this year, we're trying to identify 20 community centers. And we're going to essentially work with those community centers to help uplift them as anchor institutions within their very community. So that means we're going in and we are physically fixing the center, like doing physical improvements to the center. we're connecting the center with gigabit broadband, and we're investing like a preliminary $50,000 grant just to help them develop a workforce development program and job training, so that is a place for that community to go and get the skills they need, get the information they need about job training, and just have a resource. And that's one way that you do it from a community standpoint. And then there's other ways that you can do it when you're just connecting households individually. But to the rural piece, I think the congressman's comments were just our last congressman out of California, it's so important because it's so quick to forget. You think like the whole country's, over 90% connected, but there are literally communities that have no connectivity. And so one thing that we're doing as a company is making sure that we're investing, that we're building out, and that we're expanding our network so it's reaching those hard to reach areas, because it is true. That is an opportunity for us to do some engagement with the federal government. And that's what Charter did. Last year, we actually announced a $5 billion investment to build out into rural communities. And we did it through the assistance of the Rural Digital Opportunities Fund. So I don't know if y'all have heard about RDOF, but it's basically an FCC program. And we participated through a reverse auction. And so that means you put bids in, and then whoever can do the job at the lowest price gets the funding. And so we were able to win $1.2 billion. So that $1.2 billion is part of that larger $5 billion that we're investing. And with that, we're going into 24 states, and we're providing connectivity to 1 million households and businesses. And we're doing it in a way that is making sure that we're reaching unserved communities, because that's the whole purpose of what the funding was made available for. And we're providing gig speeds to those communities, because those are new developments. That's new infrastructure that we're building out. And where we're not, we're just trying to expand our network into those areas. So that's just an example of, how companies like ours are, putting our money where our mouth is. We're really trying to put the money in to make sure that we're delivering the connectivity that's needed for these communities, and at the same time prioritizing digital inclusion and adoption efforts. They go hand in hand. You can't separate them, really.
Thank you, Laura. Now, I actually like to ask one question to the whole panel, and if we can just keep it truncated so we get everybody, and I hope you're getting your questions ready, because we are coming to you. And that is, obviously one of I think this. I don't think collectively as a country and as really globally that we really recognize the significance of the digital divide until the pandemic, was really, it's really impacted, and we saw why it was so necessary to have digital access. The silver lining in that is that what I like to know is, like, what have you learned? And what have you been able to improve on with your respective organizations? Or what have you seen? Like one thing that you've seen about that out of the pandemic that has impacted how efforts are being made now to close the digital divide. And Laura, let's start with you.
Yeah, the pandemic is tough, especially for families that had kids at home, which I'm kind of having flashbacks because my kids are home from summer break right now. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, thank God we're not doing that anymore. But they'll be in camp next week, so it's fine. But what I take from it is that when there's an investment of time and funding, things happen. There's good outcomes. But for the pandemic, it was like a mad rush to get devices to families and schools, to get the connectivity into schools, to get it into homes. And we were able to do that. And from a provider perspective, we were able to keep pace with that significant influx of people getting online, something that we weren't even expecting, but yet our networks held up, and they were successful at being able to deliver the connectivity that customers needed and wanted. And so I think now that we have like all of this legislation that's been passed, all of this money that's being pushed out the door, for broadband and going into states, and it's just, there is a way to leverage that new money that's coming in to do things right and actually make sure that we're addressing the adoption gap and also addressing the connectivity gaps that we see within communities. But it takes a really big effort by local policymakers at the state level, and it also takes a great level of commitment by even our federal policymakers to have like the strength to say, this is how it needs to be done. This is what is going to work for my constituents, whether it's politically popular or not. I think everyone has a role to kind of make those decisions and say, this is the best path forward. And it takes everyone coming to the table, including industry, including policymakers, as well as stakeholders, community stakeholders. So it's should be interesting next couple of years.
Oh, sure. Our president and CEO, Michael Howell, talks about this a lot, but we really think that that the pandemic was one of the cable industry's finest hours. We had to pivot, our member companies and their frontline employees had to pivot very, very quickly to the, as Laura said, the huge increase in traffic from the transition from working in offices to working at home. And their ability to do that seamlessly. Folks were able to, get on Zoom, which was a novelty back in March of 2020, and now we, are growing tired of looking at each other in 2-inch screens. But so to Congressman Vesey's point, it's great to be back in person with everybody. But the fact that they did not take any time off, they were continuing to build out those networks, continuing to connect unserved households, and doing so safely and quickly. And I'm just really proud of the industry and the companies that comprise the cable industry's dedication and work in that regard. Congressman Vesey talked about the emergency broadband benefit. We worked closely with policymakers in trying, to make sure that the policy was right to be able to roll that out quickly and effectively, and also working with local communities to do that. NCTA established with partners what's called the K-12 Bridge to Broadband initiative, where our companies worked with school districts across the country to identify households that had school-age children who did not have a high-speed internet connection in their home, and work to get them connected at no cost to the student's household. And then, lastly, where all of our companies are actively and excitedly participating in the Affordable Connectivity Program, which provides a $30 a month discount to monthly bills. In addition to that, though, our companies have increased their speeds, their connection speeds, and reduced their cost. So for all intents and purposes, the ACP plans and folks who are able to avail themselves of that $30 benefit, they pay $0 a month in order to have a high-speed broadband connection in their house, and that's something that we're all very proud of.
Thank you. Tawana.
So I'm going to start with just saying that from the pandemic, the lesson learned is the critical nature of connections. And I'm going to use connections broadly. I know we're talking about digital divide issues, but it's not just connections to the internet, but connections to all sectors of your life, whether it's education, whether it's work, whether it's healthcare, whether it's entertainment, whether it's doing business, and how essential that digital connection is. And sometimes, primarily before the pandemic, we had the option to do online or in person. But what was made very evident is that some people really didn't have an option, that in person was their lifeline. And so with the pandemic, we've had to now reimagine how to have options for everyone. And those options for everyone means digital opportunity for everyone. And what we're doing now in terms of addressing the digital divide, whether it's going at it from the affordability angle or from the digital skills angle or for a representation angle in terms of role models and where people are and where they aren't, is reimagining how we approach connections, how we approach making things accessible. And so we're talking about broadband here, but accessibility is really a broader term, not only in terms of lower income, persons of color, but also persons with disabilities. All of these things came into play when people could not leverage their connections. And so, and I would say it takes an effort from everybody. It's not just one sector's problem, it's all of our problems. Whether we're the affected person or whether we're the people who have the access and others don't. We need to figure out, okay, how did I get there? So we talk about STEM. I'm sitting here now as a special advisor to Chairwoman Rosenworcel. I happen to be an attorney, but I went to school as a double major in mathematics and international affairs. You wouldn't really know that. No one would really ask that question. They would say, oh, she's an attorney. No, I actually also happen to be a STEM person. Math is a passion for me. But there are other people out there who can also pursue that passion, live that passion. And you don't have to be a teacher. You could be something else. You could be on a basketball team and be a part of STEM. So it's about pursuing your passion and not being limited, and to leverage, identify, value, and experience your connections.
Thank you. Rosa.
I think my colleagues have expressed it very clearly and very well. I think the main thing we have learned, and again, I'm very glad because I've been working on this issue for many years. I'm glad that our country finally understands that having connections and being connected and having the skills to be able to use those connections is something completely essential. Now we have an opportunity to solve this problem once and for all. Congress has allocated a lot of money for this issue, and that money is going to be given to the states, and the states get to decide how to solve this issue in their state. And it's very important the local leaders focus on helping unserved communities first and underserved communities before we use the money for anything else. Because as one of the members mentioned, there are many communities across the country that have zero access. And there's people all over the country that have no skills when it comes to using, the internet. So we have to focus on those communities. We have to connect the communities that are not currently connected, and we have to give, provide the skills for the people that don't have the skills. Because even if we are able to successfully connect everyone in the country, the digital divide is not going to be closed, because we're still going to have pockets and thousands of people, millions of people that don't have the skills they need in order for them to navigate this online world and be able to successfully complete an application, a job application, successfully do their homework, etc., if they don't have the skills. And we cannot leave any communities behind, because as I always say, especially a community as important and as big as the Latino community, I always say this, and I won't get tired of repeating it because it's very important. If we leave the Latino community behind in this country, we are going to leave the future of America behind. So we cannot. If we want to be competitive as a nation, if we want to be prepared as a nation for the jobs of the future, then this needs to happen. We need to close the digital divide, and we got to make sure that everyone in the Latino community is connected and that they have the skills so that they're able to benefit from and contribute to our very much a society that's dependent on technology and innovation.
Ms. Rosen. Dale.
Sure, I'll stick with the theme of connection and kind of put a different twist on it. We definitely learned during the pandemic, and after, again, doing Internet Essentials for a decade, we did, small business programs. We did, various Wi-Fi lift zones throughout the country to help broad swaths of population stay connected during the pandemic. But ultimately, bridging the digital divide, we see a lot more success when there's, I know Saul mentioned that you used the word navigator, when there's a digital navigator to help someone get connected, stay connected, and utilize and be able to understand the entirety of what what lays in front of them. And just Monday, Boston Consulting Group did a study on this and surveyed people who had used a digital navigator, and some of the numbers kind of speak for themselves. Like 65% of the people that went through a digital navigator signed up for internet access, but that number bumps when you talk to Black and Latino families to 72% signed up for some sort of program, largely due to ACP. 85% said that they were utilizing the internet more frequently, 50% that said they found better healthcare options for themselves and their family. 40% said they found, support with just basic needs like, food, housing, childcare. So we're investing now at Comcast, and we just announced in Detroit, we're going to start funding, working with community partners again to fund digital navigators to help connect some of the dots for the folks that are on the other side of the digital divide. But that has been a clear, just something that has definitely become clear through our experience with Internet Essentials, and especially the pandemic, is that direct touch with the community and that safe place to have trust with someone in the community means a lot. It definitely is the way to get people to sign up and understand what's available to them.
Thank you. Can you send me that?
Sure, absolutely.
That's great. I need all the information. That's fantastic. One thing, this is, the Congressional Hispanic Leadership event. There are policymakers here. We have two congressmen here. There are policymakers watching. People listen. It's influential. You have, a certain vantage point, and just sort of an open question. Is there anything you would like to tell policymakers who are watching on what you believe should be efforts to close the digital divide once and for all? I believe it was Rosa who mentioned the Infrastructure Act, getting $65 billion, for this. Is there more needed? Is there more initiatives needed? I just, open question to the panel. What would you tell policymakers? What?
I'll go first. So I think it's really important to consider all of the aspects that come into deployment. So when we're talking about reaching the last mile in that high cost area, or those hard to reach areas, there are a lot of challenges with deploying broadband connectivity there. And I think the congressman discussed it very well when he talked about his street and how, it's just a few homes there. So how do we make sure companies can go in and provide that connectivity? So my call to action, I guess, for policymakers is to be thoughtful about how you're moving with policies around how to make sure that broadband deployment is happening in a quick way. Because what we're seeing as a company that's deploying, there's a lot of challenges when it comes to going, particularly into rural areas, to build out our networks. We need to have access to infrastructure, including things like utility poles, to be able to connect our network and our cables so that we can deliver that connectivity, particularly across rural communities. And by nature of how rural communities are, there's a lot of, it's not a densely populated area. There's a lot of space, meaning there's a lot of infrastructure, there's a lot of poles we need to connect to. And so if we're not able to do that in an efficient way, and we're not able to gain access, and this is for a lot of different companies, even just attaching to public utility infrastructure it can be challenging, and it delays projects, and it oftentimes increases the project cost, and sometimes it altogether just cancels out projects. They can't even be completed. So I think policymakers should think through those challenges for broadband providers, and also other providers that are providing service in some of these rural areas, because it's not always going to be a Charter or a Comcast. There's other providers that are also going to need to go in, and we just need to think through making sure things are put in place, rules are put in place in an efficient and smart way. And I think the regulators also have a role there, right? The Federal Communications Commission. So we have a representative here, and I'm sure that she's working hard on those issues as well.
I'm happy to go next.
Yeah, sure.
Just to add on to what Laura said, we've been talking a lot about adoption, but access is also an issue, particularly as Congressman Valdeo talked about in rural communities. The ability to, so there are several barriers, I think, to deployment. One certainly is the global supply chain issues that not just broadband providers are facing, but I think all businesses at large are going through right now. Just procuring the equipment necessary to be able to connect those households. Permitting delays are also significant barriers to deployment, and then also, as Laura said, the cost to attach to those poles. Oftentimes, in order to string your cable for a mile, you're having to attach to anywhere from 10 to 13 poles. There's a cost associated with attaching to each one of those poles. And so, and then the last thing I would mention is just there's a very tight labor market. And so, as we've all been talking about, there's lots and lots of broadband money in the system right now. But there are a shortage of employees in order to work to deploy that. And then I think the last thing I would say, and thank you for the opportunity, is just that one size doesn't fit all. The challenges in the things that work in urban areas don't necessarily work in rural areas. There are specific and unique challenges from community to community, and it's important that all of those issues are taken into account holistically when you're writing policies that are going to impact the country.
Thank you. Well, so as promised, why don't we turn now to the Q&A portion of this event? And let's see. Yeah, go ahead. So there's the microphone. Maurice is going to hand you the microphone.
This has been, I'm definitely not an expert in this subject, so I find the discussion very enlightening. My question is this: as the panels discussed, the need for access, especially in underserved communities, minority communities, and as well as in rural. As my very amateur perspective is, as quickly as you have access, there's a need for services to service that access and upgrade very quickly the technology that's in place. What is your perspective in, if you reach a goal of access, everybody's got access, then how is it sustainable? Is it through policy that is always giving funding? Is it through private sector continuous, funding of communities that cannot afford it? I just wondered, how do you continue the investment in these communities that we want to have access? Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to take that?
I'm happy to address it quickly. I think it's a great question. And the reason being that when you're seeing how federal subsidies are being used, there's a question of if federal funding is completely funding a project, particularly if it's maybe like a municipality that's using that money to develop some type of a network in their community. If there's not a constant flow of funding, how is that sustainable? For companies like ours, like Charter, we are putting a lot of our own capital into the build out that we're doing. So in the cases where we are working with government and like in the program that I had mentioned earlier, the RDOF program, where we pulled some funding and we were able to deploy, that's not going to need to be a continual investment from government to maintain what we build. That comes from us. So I think that's a really, the point that you raised is a really important one for policymakers to keep in mind, because the choices that you make in terms of how projects are built out have consequences, right? And so 10 years down the line, some of those projects may not be there if they can't sustain themselves. So that's something that we certainly need to think through as an industry as well as policymakers.
If I could add one thing to that. So the cable industry has invested hundreds of billions in private capital to build out these networks all across the country. And to answer your question, our members are constantly innovating and improving their technology and upgrading their services that are available, including speeds. The industry has created the 10G initiative with a goal of reaching speeds of 10 gigabits a second here in the very near future through sort of the existing infrastructure and making upgrades to modems and to other equipment that's currently in the system. But we're really excited to be able to deliver these tremendous speeds. Now customers are able to get 1 gig or 2 gig speeds. To go to 10 is pretty tremendous, and just to think about all of the different applications that we can't envision yet that are going to be able to take advantage of those speeds once they're available. So all of that to say that wholesale change isn't needed, that NCTA's members are working with great conviction to make those available, to increase the speeds and to make them available quickly by upgrading, not necessarily wholesale change of all new plant all across the country.
Great. Who's next? Who has a question? In front. 1 second. I'm just going to wait for the mic. 1 second.
Hi, thank you guys so much. I was just wondering if you guys have seen just kind of throughout your career, what kind of implications for these minority communities, like expanding internet access, both for students and just the public at large, has improved school safety or public safety in ways, if any?
Public safety.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is is expanding internet access for people improving their safety in any ways? Or do you see implications of that for the future? Does that make sense?
I don't know that I fully understand the question, but I can give you a general answer. I mean, I think we all know that having access to the internet is helpful for everything, right? Because technology impacts every aspect of our lives. The way we communicate with people, the way we access healthcare, the way we access education, the way we apply for jobs. So it's a part of our lives in every way, shape, and form. So sure, if there's access to the internet in any public space or in any space for that matter, obviously when it comes to emergencies or sort of a situation like that, then yes, having that access would improve safety, right? It would help people, call 911 or whatever it is, right? So because connectivity is part of every aspect of our lives, I would say the answer is yes, right? It does help.
I would also say that, looking at safety more broadly, as you just started to, that the access has allowed people to be able to connect, whether it's in times of emergency or if it's in the context of education or working. So if you can imagine, and you don't really have to imagine, during the COVID scenario, there were some people who were just shut down. They could not connect with anybody. They could not work because they did not have that access. So the access is a pipeline not only to just existing, but also connecting. So I hope that helps.
I just wanted to add from a public safety or personal safety. So one of the things that's really more about I think you're getting at a little bit of the Internet of Things as well, is just the connectivity as well in the home. So for example, we saw during the pandemic and even a little bit before, but I think a little bit more during the pandemic, where families could connect through their computers on home or even to devices and check on each other and check on kids and being able to just kind of check in with each other like they couldn't before, right? So you could have a conversation with someone that is at their home computer at home and still connect to you through an app that you may have on your phone, right? So I could connect to you on your phone, but I'm connecting via my computer at home. Does that make sense? So in some cases, I think that it helped with some families have a little bit of a sense of security. It added other opportunities to what was mentioned earlier, like there's a lot of other ways to get connected, other ways to check on each other. So also check on each other to like make sure you're okay, like make sure that we're doing okay, because there were a lot of people that had extra anxiety. We had, people with the depression that kind of settled in, students who were in class or couldn't get to class. We have a friend whose son was in football and then couldn't engage in football and do everything else, but they try to figure out how to connect with each other. So maybe not completely as a big public safety, but it does add to the connectivity and the connections and the safety and the feeling of safety when you're not in school with all your friends. There's a different way to still stay connected. Does that help?
Well, can I just add one thing? So I'll just say, kind of go in more policy, want to keep me honest here. We had to, because, I mean, honestly, we had to go, we went, there had to be legislation to make sure that 911 worked over VoIP, which is what everybody uses now, which is voice over internet protocol, which is what we all speak on now, but we didn't, right, back then. So we had to make sure 911 worked when you called somebody through an internet connection rather than just like a coiled copper line, like old school when you'd pick up and have a dial tone. So, there are policy implications to that. So to your point, what's after the internet, and will 911 still have to work? Yeah. And will policymakers probably have to do something in the law to make sure it works with whatever's after the internet? Probably. But yeah. And then from a public health perspective, it's just, whatever you're willing to disclose to your doctor or to whoever, right? Like now my daughter is asthmatic. So now we have a little $40 cube that is an air quality monitor so that we know what's in the air and do we need to worry about, but it's like sitting there in our house and it was, not expensive, and I can just go on my phone and say, oh, hey, the light turned yellow. There's like some severe allergens or VOCs in the air. Better close the window. I mean, so it's amazing what can be done.
Just to add on to Marianne, thank you for bringing up the Internet of Things, and that's what Leo was talking about, this air quality device. But my grandfather is in an assisted living facility. He has a fall risk and wears a device that connects via Wi-Fi to the internet, and alerts the nursing station and calls his emergency contacts, whenever that is triggered. All of my, I have Ring doorbell on my front door and a video camera, spotlight on the backyard. All of those things connect to Wi-Fi, which we don't have enough time, but we could talk about unlicensed spectrum and how great and important Wi-Fi is. But all of those sort of things I think are put in place, to answer your initial question, sort of in schools and other public places, to try to,
Great question. Mauricio, do you have a question online?
Yeah, I have a question from Paula. She asked, how can someone like myself, a quote unquote average folk, be part of the solution to the digital divide?
Oh, that's a great question. What I was going to say, if I got the time to come to the other question about what policymakers could do, I was actually going to flip it and say what everyone else can do for one policymaker, being the FCC, is to provide input and to tell your stories about what's really happening. And we do rulemakings and we ask people to file comments, and not everyone can file comments. Not everyone desires to file comments, but in order for us to be able to come up with solutions that address particular scenarios, we need to become informed about the scenarios. We can't go to every place, but people can provide us their stories so we can say, oh, that's a story. Just like it was an impression to hear the stories that we heard from the congressman. We want to hear those kind of stories from the regular people, the consumers that are actually impacted, who don't have access. Those that have access and says, yeah, you think you solved it for me, but there's this other problem over here that's further down the road for those who are going to get access tomorrow. So we need to have sort of this full approach to get perspectives from how people are affected, what people can do to help solve the issue, but also you may have the answer. You may say, hey, have you thought about doing X, Y, and Z? We want to hear that too, because we don't have all the answers. So we need everyone to give their buy-in and their approach. So before I drop the mic, I wanted to say, we've talked about ACP and Affordability Connectivity Program, Affordable Connectivity Program. You can go to affordableconnectivity.gov to see if you're eligible. You can also on that, at that website, also check how to get a service, to apply for it, and to also find out whether your providers are near you. I also want to add that we've talked a lot about how some people just have mobile phones and don't have devices in the home. There's also programs where you can get, if you pay at least $10, that you can get a credit towards a device as part of the ACP program. So I wanted to put that out there so that I make sure that you at least get that from our presentation here today.
Rose, did you want to say something?
Actually, I was going to say exactly that.
Okay.
That one of the many things we all can do is ensure the people that need the support know about these programs. All of us in this room, we're lucky, right? That we don't have an issue with paying for our service, our internet service, but there are so many people in this country that cannot afford it. So spread the word. Talk to everybody that you know, your neighbors, your friends, about this FCC program, because it's a program that can really, really help some folks. And we got to educate our communities about these opportunities that many people don't know exist.
Wait, this gentleman right here, because he's got a notepad and he looks like a reporter, so I want to give him a mic. He might be a kindred spirit here, a future journalist.
Thank you. In the recent subcommittee on communications featuring the director of the NTIA, the Davis-Bacon Act was highlighted in discussions of how effectively broadband could be deployed. So I was wondering if any of you could speak to the potential of the new Infrastructure Act, as well as the NTIA, to favor union labor and union states over right-to-work states, and how that could affect the overall success of broadband deployment.
That's a big question.
Yeah,
That is a great question. I mean, I can say we're because there have been, because the deployment of these funds is going to be so targeted state by state, we're still kind of, I just speak for Comcast, we're still kind of evaluating to see what the, what's the overall impact going to be. Because that's going to be a kind of a state jurisdiction by jurisdiction kind of thing, right? Our headquarters is in Pennsylvania. We have some business in Texas. I mean, so we're just going to have to see how everything kind of pans out.
great. Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you very much for allowing me to be of service here as the moderator for this incredible panel. I hope you learned something. I definitely did. And with that, I'd like to turn back to Marianne Gomez Horta, the Chile president CEO. You sure we're not related, distant cousins?
We probably
I think maybe, yeah, probably, yeah.
We probably are.
All right,
We'll do that
thanks.
ancestry.com thing later and figure it out. So again, thank you, everyone. Please join me in a round of applause for Fien Gomez, for the panelists, for our congressional members' input. Thank you again. And it's already been mentioned, but I want to emphasize, we always ask people at the end of these discussions to please take the time to share what you learned with other people who weren't in the room, who weren't able to join us via Zoom. Please take the time to be an advocate for others, to share with them, what you've learned and how they can get involved. Not only checking on the FCC website of what's going on, but the members that were here, if you haven't already called your member of Congress, if you're watching, if you don't know who your member is, and I tell people all this time, it doesn't matter if you voted for the member. If you have an idea, if something is important to you in your community, in your small business, in your family, please reach out to those offices and let them know, because it's important that they get that input as well. And of course, now everybody knows how to find you, Duana. So, okay, you got to get ready for that. So again, I also want to just wrap up with a special thanks to the team here, Mauricio, Emily, Christian, Maite, our interns, Gabby, Nicole, Jeanette, and Vanessa, as well as Catherine. And then the last is our Future Leaders Conference is next month on July 28th. It will be here in Washington, hosted by the National Association of Broadcasters. And we will also have that via Zoom available for students who are not able to participate and young professionals. And with that, God bless. Thank you again for being here. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you.